Back we come to the Psalms, and certainly we had a very lively discussion and interaction a few days ago before the break, and kind of got us ready to what we'll do with Psalms and Proverbs, because we did very, very quickly go through the themes that we find within the Psalms. And as I said, as those themes are listed for you, and I've given you also a chart from Tov's with his themes and purpose, that anyone who reads through the Psalms obviously recognizes that first and foremost we have the revelation of God within the Psalms, as the psalmist individually speaking for Israel, reflected upon the experiences that God had taken them through, directed by the Holy Spirit. They respond in prayer, in petition, in praise to Yahweh. And so it is, as it were, that we have the servants of Yahweh revealing the person of Yahweh within their prayers and their praises, as seen within the Psalms. We also saw that the God that is seen within the Psalms is the God of creation, the God who is sovereign over Israel and over the nations, that ultimately is going to accomplish his will upon the earth that he has made. And yet, until the kingdom comes, until God's sovereign plan and purpose, as far as the kingdom comes to fruition, the righteous who pray within the Psalms, and obviously within Israel's worship, it is the righteous who enter the spirit of the Psalms. They speak to Yahweh of their circumstance, living among the wicked. And these are not just the wicked of the nations, these are the wicked within Israel as well. And they ask for deliverance and plead for Yahweh to deal with the wicked, as he will, because of his basic attributes of loving kindness and faithfulness and righteousness and compassion. And he will act because of the covenant that he has made with David. And so we can broadly say that the purpose of the Psalms is to give us the praises and prayers and praises of the righteous. The Old Testament saints, as they awaited the coming of God's kingdom. And we spoke about the fact that there has been, within the last generation, among scholars of the Psalms, more of a realization that the Psalter, the book of Psalms, is not put together in a haphazard fashion. That as the Psalter has come together, that there is a flow as far as the structure is concerned. In the chart book, John Walton, on page 51, John Walton is one of the scholars who has interacted quite extensively with the structure of the Psalms. And then we'll come back to Tov's structure in just a second. But to see, and this has been based upon some of the work that goes back to Gerald Wilson, the Wilson of the expositional volume on the Psalms that is in your bibliography. But seeing the fact that, all right, as you come to the Psalms, and there's pretty much universal agreement on this today, the Psalm 1 and 2 as they stand within the book today, are introduction to the whole of the Psalms. Walton would see the first psalm, as you can see, as the ultimate vindication of the righteous. We see that within the conclusion, verse 6. Yahweh knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. The way of the wicked will come to an end. But the righteous will stand in God's ultimate judgment. They will be vindicated because of their righteous lifestyle lived as they live in accordance with the Torah. The wicked has rejected Torah, has rejected that lifestyle for his own ways. And ultimately, it is the righteous who will be vindicated. And then in Psalm 2, he labels this God's choice and defense of the Israelite king. And he would see the second psalm as speaking first and foremost of David, but David foreshadowing the ultimate king who is going to come, the King Messiah, and the fact that God is going to establish his kingship within the future. But in the meantime, until that takes place, God's choice and God's defense of David and the Davidic line is a reality as far as history is concerned. And he refers to the Psalms, as you can see, as a cantata, as a symphony, as it were, with different movements that relate to the Davidic covenants. He sees Book 1, and the theme is just the final psalm with the final doxology at the end, and particularly the doxology being the theme that was added later in most scholars' understanding of the Psalms as it was put together. And he would say, because, as we've already seen, that predominantly within the first book we have Davidic Psalms. That from Psalm 3 to Psalm 41, only two of the Psalms come to us anonymously. That the rest are Davidic Psalms as far as a notation of authorship is concerned. And he says that this is reflective of David's conflict with Saul. He had been chosen by Yahweh as king, 1 Samuel chapter 16, reflected as far as Walton would be concerned in the second psalm, and David being a righteous man whose way was going to prosper, Saul being the wicked man whose way was going to come to an end, who was going to perish. And we see within the first book these Davidic Psalms, where the Psalms, many of them, mention the enemies of the psalmist and God praying for deliverance, and he sees these as basically coming from David's conflict with Saul. And then after God does deliver in the second book, we see Psalms which flow out of and praise David's kingship. That even though we still have lament and enemy psalms, because David's kingship, he still came under attack, both from Absalom and from others within the nation, and of course with the enemies of the nations around about him, particularly the Ammonites in 2 Samuel chapter 10 to 12, that the Psalms reflect the kingship of David and end in the 72nd Psalm with a praise of the establishment of David's kingship by Solomon, and how that kingdom reached the height of its glory as far as the Old Testament was concerned. Then he sees, and I think rightfully so as far as the theme, that in Psalm 73 to 89, Israel is going through intense suffering. In fact, to the end in Psalm 89, where the psalmist is crying out to the Lord, has he forgotten the Davidic covenants? Now, Walton sees this as reflective of what he refers to as the 8th century Assyrian crisis, When the Assyrians invade and take the northern kingdom captive and come and desolate the land, as the prophet Isaiah has given to us during the time of Hezekiah, and literally desolate the land and surround Jerusalem, and God brings his great deliverance. And so this is a reflection, according to Walton, of that crisis. And then in book 4, as he says, this is introspection about the destruction of the temple and exile, that these psalms emerge now out of the exilic context of Israel that began with the northern kingdom going into Assyrian captivity, and then obviously the Judeans joining them in the Babylonian captivity. And then book 5 is praise and reflection after the exile and the beginning of a new era, anticipating, obviously, the ultimate establishment of God's kingdom that then in the final 5 Psalms brings us to the crescendo of praise as far as Yahweh is concerned. Now this is Walton's approach. And I think broadly he is right. Which means narrowly, I think he isn't. But I think as far as the flow of seeing David and the establishment of David's kingship, and yet the Davidic line, along with all Israel, suffering and yet anticipating what God is going to do in the future, is certainly so. Basically, as far as the books in the basic content, I think that he is right on. Although I would lean more toward Tov's when it comes particularly to the themes. So let's come back to what I passed out for you a week ago. If you didn't get one during the break, the hard copy of this is available for you from Tov's. As far as the narrative structure of the Psalms are concerned, and realizing that Walton put his proposal into print, what you have in that chart in your chart book, was put into print late 80s, early 90s by Walton. Wilson's work goes back to the late 70s and mid 80s, so Wilson really was the first scholar to extensively write on the structure of the Psalter. Then we have Walton, and then Tov's has interacted even further with Wilson and with Walton and with others. And as I said, with an ETS paper in the late 90s, this is his narrative structure. And to my knowledge at this point, this was only given to ETS. This is not available in any kind of publication. It hasn't been published in a journal or anything like that at this point. Well, it's T-O-E. It's wherever I already put those away. It is Tov's. Remember on that sheet I gave you his themes, Brian G. Tov's. T-O-E-W-S. There it is. So you know where this came from. Now again, this is, can I put it this way? Again, gentlemen, this is only suggestive. This is not the law of the Medes and Persians. This is not, we have figured out the structure of the Psalms. This is, if I can put it this way in the words of J. Sidlow Baxter, this is for your godly contemplation. This is for you as you come to the Psalms to at least have a map to start to think through, why is this psalm here with this psalm preceding it and this psalm coming after it? And certainly I agree with the fact that the Psalms, particularly in the first 2 books, emerge, and obviously all the Davidic Psalms and all 5 books emerge out of David's life. And were then given over to the choir directors along with the other Levites that were responsible for the Psalms, along with the Psalm of Moses and the 2 Psalms of Solomon, and ultimately collected into the order that we have today. Now, he speaks about book 1, as David in exile trusts in the Lord for his deliverance. I would, along with Walton, move Psalm 1 and 2 to be an introduction to the whole book of Psalms. And obviously, corollary, also an introduction to book 1. But the thrust of book 1 begins in the 3rd Psalm, Psalm 3 through 41. What leads us to say that Psalm 1 and 2, and probably they are distinct psalms because they emerge from different psalmists. If the New Testament is accurate in Psalm 4, and we believe that it is, the 2nd Psalm is Davidic. These are the words of David, according to Acts chapter 4. Why are the nations in an uproar and the people devising a vain thing? This is a very, very early psalm. Usually the 1st psalm is viewed as being later, as maybe even being post-exilic. In fact, remember the chart that I showed you of the fact that historical grammatical exegesis means finding all of the psalms and the historical background, and the fact that the chart said that this was written in 444 BC by Ezra, tied in with Nehemiah chapter 8. Well, I'm not going to go quite that far, but I think there is, and the tradition was, that the 1st Psalm does emerge from the post-exilic period and does have overtones of the wisdom that was seen, presented by Ezra and the Levites associated with him to the post-exilic generation. But as they stand now, it is very interesting that the 1st Psalm begins on a note of the blessed man. How blessed is the man. And then it goes on to describe him. And the 2nd Psalm ends on a note of the blessed ones. How blessed are all who take refuge in him. Who take refuge in whom? Take refuge in the King. Why? Because there is a conflict taking place during the present age between the wicked and the righteous. In fact, the 1st Psalm begins by describing the righteous man negatively. The blessed man, and the blessed man is the man of fortune, the man who is favored, the man who is to be prospered by God. And obviously goes back to all the way to the Torah on the blessed man is the one who will experience God's creative blessing of fruitfulness and multiplication and fullness as far as the earth is concerned. A blessed condition that will come as he renders faithful obedience to Yahweh, as did Abraham. So that in Abraham, all of the families of the earth will be blessed, will find their place of abundance and prosperity, their place of contentment, of the face of God in their relationship to Yahweh through the Abrahamic covenant. And of course, the one who disdains Abraham and Abraham's God is the one who is under God's curse and will come under judgment. Well, the blessed man is the man who lives among the cursed ones, who lives among the wicked, the sinners, and the scoffers, and yet does not listen and participate in their lifestyle. The blessed man is the one who does not walk. That is, whose lifestyle, whose conduct is not according to the counsel, the instruction of the wicked. He doesn't listen and get his directions from those who are criminals against God, who disregard God's standard and in its place put their own. He doesn't walk, he doesn't conduct himself according to their advice. I think of that every time I look at the paper and see all the advice columns. You know, what, Dear Abby, Dear Ann, there's so many dear. Reader's Digest even has their Dear Somebody today. Well, you can write to all the dear ladies that write advice columns, but there are ways that they are saying, the counsel they're giving on how to live your life is not God's way. It's not God's ways. Don't walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. By the way, the wicked counsel will lead to sinful behavior, and the participation in sinful behavior will lead one to scoff and scorn and ridicule and mock God and God's standards. So the blessed one is the one who does not get his direction from the wicked, but in verse 2 gets his direction from Yahweh. He delights in the law and the Torah of Yahweh, and in his Torah he meditates day and night. Delight has the idea of he's just enthralled. He's enchanted. He can't take his eyes off of the Torah. He can't get enough of it. And in fact, upon that Torah, he is continually meditating. It's like what some of the seniors have said in their testimony on how when God brought them to himself and they were regenerate, they could not get enough of Scripture. They just had to read. They just, every waking moment was then consumed with the reading and study of the Word. And even then, when you're away from it, you're driving in your car, you're at your work, whatever, what is going through your mind continually? The Word. Because it is so delightful. So that every spare moment, you're so captured by the Torah, so that every moment you're continually going over it in your mind. The result is, he's like a firmly planted tree. His roots go deep. And he is fruitful. He is prosperous. And so the first three verses give the description of the blessed man, the righteous man. Then in verse 4 and 5, the psalmist says it very quickly. Everything I've just said about the righteous man, the blessed man, is not true of the wicked. In fact, he doesn't go into a lengthy description of the wicked. He just says, the wicked are not so. The wicked do not delight in the Torah. The wicked do not meditate upon it continually. The wicked follow the way of other wicked individuals. And wicked basically has the idea of a criminal, one who rebels and rejects the standard. And of course, the standard within the psalm is the Torah. He is the wicked man. He's the rebel against God's standard, and therefore the rebel against God. So he doesn't delight, he doesn't meditate in Torah. He follows his own wicked devices. He scoffs against God. He scorns everything. He is sinful in his behavior. And so, instead of being like a tree, he's like chaff. That when they winnowed the grain, the chaff was just blown away. That's what the wicked are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore, since he's like chaff, the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. All right, judgment is going to come, and the wicked are going to be literally blown away. Because the Lord knows, he's intimate with the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will come to an end. Now, this is very important as you get into the Psalms, because the way of the wicked does not come to the end as you go through the Psalms. The wicked are very present. And their scoffing and mocking of Yahweh is seen in their mocking and scoffing and their opposition to the righteous. And of course, the psalmist is the righteous one, and speaking for the righteous ones, who, of course, reminds God about the wicked and about the opposition and the scorn that he is enduring. And yet the first psalm is a reminder that ultimately anchor yourself in the Torah. For in the end, it is the man of Torah who is going to be delivered, not the wicked man. Now, what is seen individually in the first psalm is then broadened out corporately in the second psalm. And the second psalm has a four-part structure, 4 stanzas. The first stanza is the psalmist observing what is taking place on the earth. The second stanza, he observes what is taking place in heaven. The third stanza is a further observation of what has been determined in heaven, so that in the fourth stanza, he speaks to those upon the earth to reverse what he observes in the first 3 verses and align themselves with what God is going to do, so that when judgment comes, they will stand. Well, in the first stanza, the first 3 verses, he asks the rhetorical question, why are the nations and the peoples agitated in an uproar, trying to come up with a plan that is empty, that will not stand? And why will their plan not stand? Because they are taking their stand and taking counsel against the Lord and against the Anointed One. And notice how again stand and counsel reflect what has been said in Psalm 1:1. All right, they are now, we might put it this way, kings. They are leaders. They are those who stand before the wicked. And as the leaders of the wicked, they come up with and are seeking a plan to defeat Yahweh and his anointed one, Yahweh and his Messiah. And of course, we've already seen in the former and the latter prophets that the anointed one is the coming king in the Davidic line. And their response is, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. This is what they are planning together. This is what they're encouraging one another to do. It's a vain plan. It's not going to come to fruition. But they are seeking to thwart God's plan to exercise his rule over the earth through his Messiah. And by the way, until the kingdom is established, it begins in the Old Testament, obviously, is seen when Christ is here upon the earth throughout the church age and the tribulation. What is the plan, if I can put it that way? What is the vain thing that the leaders of the wicked are seeking to accomplish? To defeat the plan of Yahweh, to establish the Messianic kingdom. Well, from there, the psalmist in verses 4 to 6, okay, this is taking place on earth. What is taking place in heaven? Yahweh's laughing. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. Now, they scoff against Yahweh. Yahweh is doing what? You stupid kings. You think that you are going to defeat my plan? He's sitting and laughing and scoffing, ridiculing, but it's going to come to an end. For in verse 5, he will speak to them in his anger and terrify them in his fury. He's not going to laugh forever. He's finally going to take action. And what is that action? Verse 6, installing his king upon Zion, his holy mountain. I might put it this way. God might be laughing now, but he's not going to laugh forever. At these, to use Isaiah's imagery, these puny little hopping grasshoppers thinking somehow they can leap over God and establish their plan and their purpose. He has made the determination that his son, his king, is going to rule. Then in verses 7 to 9, on the basis of that decree, verse 7, now we see the king speaking in heaven. Verse 7 to 9, I will surely tell of the decree. Decree has the idea of a covenant stipulation. Okay, the reflection of this is the Davidic covenant. God has said to David, your seed will establish your throne forever. I will tell of that decree. God has determined that I will rule upon Zion. He said to me, you are my son, today I have begotten thee. Begotten in the sense that, okay, by being, as it were, the offspring of God. He's not saying he was physically born. He's saying, all right, he has the privileges being the Son of God. He has the sonly privileges. Yahweh has said, ask of me, and I will surely give the nations as your inheritance. You will break them with a rod of iron, shatter them like earthenware. Yahweh's already made that commitment to the Son. It's already embodied within the Davidic covenants. Now we just await the time when the Son says to the Father, all right, I'm ready for the nations to be my footstool. And then the laughing will come to an end and the kingdom will be established. So with that insight, the psalmist turns in verses 10 to 12, now therefore, O king, show discernment. Take warning, O judges, O leaders of the earth. Instead of your vain plan, worship, literally serve Yahweh with reverence and rejoice with trembling. Literally kiss the Son being the Aramaic term is given to the nations. Kiss the Son. Kissing having the idea of, again, paying homage. Recognize him as your king, lest he become angry and you perish in the way and his wrath soon be kindled. Before he comes to establish his kingdom, the blessed man is the one who takes refuge in the coming Messiah. Because when he comes, going back to the first psalm, that's the end of the wicked. They're going to perish. And so you better turn in faith to the coming king before you perish in the way when his wrath is kindled. And the first two psalms set the tone of the whole book. The blessed man anticipates in faith the coming of the Messiah. That is his hope. And with that as his hope, he lives his life in accordance with Torah, where the first revelation of that coming king was given by Moses. And he lives in accordance with God's standard. The wicked do not do so. They rebel against God's standard and follow the leadership of men who seek to defeat God's plan, but they will not be able to do so. God's plan will be established, and so the nations and their leaders should beforehand come to take refuge in that coming king. And by taking refuge, as a blessed individual, live in accordance with God's plan. Now that is the word of the psalmist and those who sing his songs with like faith. So that from Psalm 3 on now, we have the prayer and praises of the righteous man, the blessed man of Psalm 1 and Psalm 2, who is anticipating the Messiah and in the meantime living according to God's Torah. And so the man of faith, the man of obedience. All right, we see in book 1, because he still lives among the wicked, like David, has to learn to trust in Yahweh for his deliverance before the kingdom is established. And so the individual, of course, who speaks within this first book is David. And so in these 39 Psalms, David, the king in exile, trusts in the Lord for deliverance from death. Now, one of the things we need to realize is that within these Psalms, we have the cry of a righteous man, as I said, David. And of course, David at this point is being a model, being an example for all who, like David, anticipate Yahweh and in the meantime seek to live by his standard. But as you go through the Psalms, understand that David, and as the righteous, use David's words to cling in faith to Yahweh as they live among the wicked. In no way is this righteous man claiming to be sinless, perfect. We see in a number of Psalms. All right, we can see in Psalm 25. Psalm 25, verse 7. Do not remember the sins of my youth and my transgressions. According to your loving kindness, remember me for your goodness' sake, O Yahweh. And notice in verse 11, for your name's sake, pardon my iniquity, for it is great. And again in verse 18, look upon my affliction and my trouble and forgive all my sins. Okay, the righteous man is not a sinless man. A righteous man is a man, because he meditates upon Torah, who recognizes his sinfulness and recognizes that Yahweh is the one who can bring forgiveness based upon the sacrifices and offerings that are seen within the Torah. In the same way, in Psalm 40, verse 12, David admits that his sins had overtaken him. And again in Psalm 41, verse 4, he refers to his sin. And yet he also refers in verse 12 to his integrity. He is a righteous man who seeks after the ways of Yahweh and deals with his sin in a God-directed fashion. So as we begin to read the Psalms, we recognize, all right, the righteous man is not a sinless man, but he's a man of integrity, a man of faith and faithful obedience toward Yahweh. Now we see in the the second book, and we've already brought this out as we get to David in the centerpiece here, that after the Psalms of Korah and Asaph, which speak about the fact that obviously, again, God is to be sought, and God is the one who will judge the godly and the ungodly. We have the great Psalm of David, Psalm 51, where David is judged because of his sin. In fact, the superscription tells us that this is the Psalm of David when Nathan the prophet came to him after he'd gone into Bathsheba. This is his prayer of confession, his prayer of repentance. And we see that, all right, God is a God, yes, who does deliver the righteous, but also does bring judgments because of the sins of the righteous one. And yet in the end, God will deliver and will deliver by bringing in the kingdom that is seen in Psalm 72. And the indication here within the second book is with David and then those who follow in David's faithful obedience, that their unrighteousness will not stop the coming of God's kingdom. However, God does judge. And the third book has been recognized by Hall as being, written during a time of intense suffering because of sin. Stated by Toves as the pure in heart, hoping God, Israel's unfaithfulness has led to judgments. And, very, very definitely so. It begins with the Psalm of Asaph that talks about the fact that God has surely been good to Israel, and yet at the time the people of Israel are suffering immensely, and Asaph is wondering about the righteousness of God, the justice of God. And yet he goes to the temple and realizes ultimately God is working for Israel's good. But in the meantime, they go through this exile that, as we said, as you come to the end in Psalm 89, even leads the psalmist to wonder, is God going to fulfill his word to David or not? The context here is the suffering, the judgment of God upon his people leads them to start to wonder about God's fulfillment of his promise. And yet, in Book 4, Israel in their exile looks to the eternal King of heaven. They realize that even though man is under God's judgment, God is eternal, and God's ways will be established. And God will bring his kingdom. The Lord will reign. And in fact, it is seen as such a reality that the present tense is used. The Lord reigns, the Lord reigns, the Lord reigns. And because he does, the wise, the righteous, the godly man can find hope in the middle of his suffering. And as we've seen in Psalm 101 to 103, we see David again reflecting that praise and trust in the midst of affliction. That now those like David in Israel going through exile are themselves experiencing. And yet, as this book ends in Psalm 104 through 106 with a reflection of God's creative work and God's work throughout the history of Israel, it ends again on a note that God would deliver his people on the basis of the Abrahamic covenants. Psalm 106. And then with that anticipation in Book 5, we have the restoration of Israel And Tov says, from exile, I would say that obviously, yes, the perspective of this final book, as of all of the book of Psalms, is the post-exilic community. But yes, they rejoice in the fact that once again God has brought them the land, the temple's been reestablished. Praise can be given to Yahweh, the sacrifices, the songs of ascent that are in the very center of this book, anticipating the fact that God is going to establish his ultimate temple, the kingdom in the future, that then leads, as we've seen in the last 5 Psalms, to the concluding praise that not only the righteous, not only Israel, but in the end, all creation is going to give praise to Yahweh. Now, what this shows, by hitting the high points, is the fact that there's a very definite structure within the Psalms. As we said, the basic themes of trust, judgment, exile, yet anticipation of the future, and then with the Psalms of restoration, looking forward to the fact that God's kingdom is ultimately going to be established, and all of the earth is going to give to Yahweh his rightful praise. That's the thrust. That's the movement that is seen as far as the Psalms as a whole is concerned. And so that's the outworking of the literary of the purpose within the literary structure of the book. Now, as I said, the 2 works that I have listed for you in the bibliography that interact with this understanding of Psalms as a book is, and the second volume hasn't been published yet, but it's on its way, but Wilson's first volume in the NIVAC, and then Grogan also in his work on the Psalms, the theology of the Psalms, also deals with the Psalms as a book and deals with these basic themes. Now, not all of these men are premillennial. That's why for them, many times it all works out in the past. And the kingdom has come, as far as they are concerned, the post-exilic generation, and particularly as that points forward to Jesus Christ and the church. So I do understand that not everyone who takes the Psalms as a book and will see this movement. Obviously, what they understand about the prophets, what they understand about Psalms. So if what the prophets were anticipating is fulfilled today within the church, then what the Psalms is anticipating is fulfilled when? Today in the church. They are consistent eschatologists as they go through the Psalms. But at least the overall structure and the basic themes of each one of the books is fairly standard within the contemporary literature of those who take what is referred to as a understanding of Psalms as needing to be read as a book, like the other books of the Old and the New Testament. So Wilson and Grogan are the 2 individuals of the bibliography that reflect this basic understanding of the Psalms. I'll again leave the mic on during break. As I said, this is just not to give you the final word. If we get to heaven and you say, or we get to the kingdom better than that, Prof, you missed a few things on there in the Psalms. I will say, I didn't claim to say that this was, the law of the Medes and Persians. This was inerrant. The text is inherent. My understanding is not necessarily inherent. But I do give it to you to start to appreciate the Psalms not only as individual expressions of spirituality, individual songs that you can use in your prayer and praise to Yahweh, but to understand something of how these individual units of praise and prayer have been brought together within this book that fits into the canon of the Old Testament. You've just finished reading the prophets. The righteous man will wait for the coming of the kingdom. The Psalms then is a book that says, all right, how do you wait? You wait using the model that is seen within these Psalms. Cling to the Lord. Trust in his coming Messiah. Live by his Torah. All right, you will go through the opposition of the wicked. All right, look to the Lord for deliverance. And yet, because of your own sin, and particularly David's sin and then Israel's sin, God has to discipline. Therefore, the kingdom doesn't immediately come. Israel goes into exile. Yet in exile, they appreciate the fact that God is going to fulfill his word. And as God delivered them in the past, it's just the anticipation, as we saw within the prophets, of what he's going to do in the future. The great second exodus is going to come. And so you can trust that this is going to take place. And the end result will be that all creation in that future day is going to praise the Lord as they were created to do. And so here is the Psalms, and then we'll lead in canonically into, all right, the righteous man should live by God's wisdom. He should live by the wisdom his Creator has given to him as he lives upon the earth. And that then brings us into Job and Proverbs, and then in the megalith to the book of Ecclesiastes. So that's more of what is known today as a broad canonical understanding of the Psalms. If you have interaction and questions, you can come during the break. Afterwards, we'll take a look at the other two interpretive issues and introduce ourselves to the wisdom literature. As I have already brought up, probably among scholars today, interpretive issue number one is the great debate today. Are we or are we not to read the Psalms as a book? And as I said, as you get into the literature of the last generation, about the last 25 years, this has become more and more of an issue. So the contemporary commentators and theologies will certainly interact with that question. The second interpretive issue, and there are many, of course, we could deal with in the Psalms, but I deal with the second one because I might put this is the most important pastoral issue you will face. As people read through the Psalms in your congregation, you've got to be ready for this question. What do I do with the calls for destruction against the psalmist's enemies? These have been classically called imprecation. An imprecation is a call for a curse, a call for calamity to come upon an individual. And certainly as you go through the Psalms, there are many imprecations. Many times when the psalmist will very detailedly, talk to the Lord about the wicked, about those who are opposing him, and call for the Lord to do something about the wicked. The problem is, and I've given you the three Psalms that are there, that in three Psalms, the imprecations become very, very precise, and can I put it this way, very, very brutal. Take a look at Psalm 58. Psalm 58, beginning in verse 6. This is a psalm of David, and he is, verse 1, do you indeed speak righteousness, O gods? Do you judge uprightly, O sons of men? No, in your heart you walk unrighteousness. Verse 3, the wicked are estranged from the womb. Verse 4, they have venom like the venom of a serpent, like a deaf cobra that steps on his ear, so that it does not hear the voice of charmers or skillful casters of spells. The wicked are just loathsome individuals, Lord. And so verse 6, oh God, shatter their teeth in their mouths. Break out the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. Let them flow like water. Verse 8, let them be as a snail who melts away as it goes along, like the miscarriages of a woman who never sees the sun. Before your pots can feel the fire of thorns, he will sweep them away with a whirlwind, the green and the burning alike. The righteous will rejoice when he sees the vengeance. He will wash his feet in the blood of the wicked. And men will say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Surely there's a God who judges on the earth. God, destroy them. Let them pay for their wickedness. So that men will say, yeah, the righteous are rewarded. There is a God who really does judge the wicked and confirm the righteous. But particularly the one that everyone doesn't like is, like the miscarriage of a woman who never sees the sun. Basically, what he's saying is, may the wicked be like the aborted child. Well, Psalm 109. Another place where the psalmist gets somewhat graphic. Again, a psalm of David. Talking again about the wicked, in fact. Verse 8, let his days be few, let another take his office. Let his children be fatherless, his wife a widow. Let his children wander about and beg. Let them seek sustenance far from their ruined homes. Let the creditor seize all that he has. Let the strangers plunder the product of his labor. Let there be none to extend loving kindness to him, nor any to be gracious to his fatherless children. Kill him and then bring the whole doom upon his children, Lord. I'm sure you've never felt that way in your prayers. But David did in his. And then Psalm 137. Psalm 137, verse 7. Remember, O Lord, the sons of Edom, the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it to his very foundation. We've already seen the Edomites cheering on. Come on, go get them. Destroy the whole city. Raise the building, the temple, so it will never raise again. O daughter of Babylon, you devastated one, how blessed is the one who repays you with the recompense with which you have repaid us. And as the Edomites cheered you on, Babylonians, you delighted in just getting the last drop of suffering from us. Babylon, how blessed is the one who will repay you in kind. In fact, verse 9, how blessed is the one who seizes and dashes your little ones against the rock. How blessed is the one who comes and takes your babies and just smashes them against the rocks. To see the blood splatter. That's what I'm longing for. Got to enter in the spirit of the psalmist, to get what he's saying. Well, how do we take this? How do we take this response of the psalmist for general vindication of themselves and calamity upon their enemies, and particularly when they get as graphic as this? Well, 4 basic opinions have been given. The first, which is very popular in liberal circles, these are evil emotions to be avoided or expressed and then quickly relinquished. All right, you might feel that way as a righteous individual about the wicked But even for the psalmist, this was a sub-religious attitude. This is evil. Now realize what they're saying. They are saying that what God has ordained to be written in Scripture is wrong. The psalmist is speaking evil words. These don't give any kind of instruction to us. They are to be rejected. But then when you're a liberal, you rejected other parts of Scripture as well, so they reject this too. A more predominant position, both within liberalism and among Orthodox commentators throughout the ages, has been position B. All right, this is consonant with Old Testament, Old Covenant morality, but is inconsistent with the New. Right? They could have this kind of vindictiveness under the Old Covenants, but now we're under the New Covenants. This ties in with the God of the Old Testament is a God of wrath. The God of the New Testament is a God of love, mercy. The Old Testament, all right, the one who was part of Israel's religion, yeah, they wanted vindication against their enemies. Now, we don't seek vindication against our enemies. We love our enemies. So remember the words of Christ that, he that would do evil to you at the end of Matthew chapter 5. Now if he wants your coat, give him two. If he wants you to walk a mile, go two. In other words, all right, show love to your enemy, no longer seeking his calamity. Well, this is, in its own way, a very, very narrow reading of the New Testament. This is the same, within the same Sermon on the Mount, Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 5. Verses 38 to 42 is where he seems to call for love toward an enemy. But notice he even says in verse 39, do not resist him who is evil, but whoever slaps you on the right cheek, okay, turn the other one. But it's very interesting before that, he's even spoken about some pretty radical surgery that should be taken by the righteous individual whose eye or hand might cause him to stumble. And of course, as usually was, just a figure of speech. Doesn't mean to literally pluck out your eye or cut off your hand. But you notice that he's also dealing very strongly with sin in the Sermon on the Mount. But also, as you go through the New Testament, it's not just here in Jesus' words, but in 2 Thessalonians 1, Paul speaks about to the Thessalonians, they can be encouraged by the fact that God is going to pay back their enemies for what they're doing to them. You certainly have in Revelation 6:10 the souls of the martyrs crying out to God to avenge their blood. And you have then God avenging the wrongs. Revelation 16:5 and 6. Revelation 19:2. In other words, it's just not a matter of the Old Testament talking about the fact that judgment is going to come upon the wicked. Third position is, all right, this is an indication of righteous indignation that could be spoken about by David and could be spoken about by Jesus and could be spoken about by the apostles because they were righteous. They could express God's righteous indignation in a righteous way. This almost is a evangelical approach to position A. But we, not having the same righteousness, it would be hypocritical for us to express the same kind of imprecations. In other words, if you are without sin, then cast the stones. If you are one who can express God's anger righteously, then go ahead and do so. But who can really do so? Now, one of the things we need to notice is there is no difference between the Old and the New Testament. The Old and the New Testament both speak about the fact that vengeance is Yahweh's. He will repay. That is seen in Deuteronomy chapter 32, 35. Yahweh is the one who will repay. And that's what the psalmists are praying. The psalmist isn't saying, within these imprecations, Lord, let me raise up an army so I can go and do what I think should be done to the wicked. What he's saying is, because these are prayers, they're imprecations, who is to do the judging? Not the psalmist, but Yahweh. And by the way, you speak about the judgment is going to come upon the wicked. Well, even, Psalm 137 about what's going to come upon the Babylonians. All the psalmist is doing at that point is praying what the prophets have already said God is going to do to Babylon for what they have done to Israel. So you read Habakkuk chapter 2 and the woes that come upon, the pronouncement of woes, the curse against the Babylonians is picked up by the psalmist when you come to Psalm 137. So I would say D is an expression of the divine curse. Those who disdain Yahweh and what Yahweh is doing through his promise, covenant promise given to Abraham and then reflected within the Psalms, his covenant promise to David. Those who reject Torah, his standards, will come under God's curse. And God has stated very clearly within the Torah and within the prophets what is going to happen to those who are under God's curse. All the psalmist is doing is reminding God to do what he himself has said that he will do to the wicked when he brings them into judgment. By the way, really, it is no different than the New Testament saint. The New Testament, the disciples being taught to pray by the Lord, what? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, when you pray that, Lord, your will be done, that assumes what? Yahweh's judgment upon those who do not do his will upon the earth. And don't you have the assurance of when God is going to deal with those? When he returns, and of course for those then who will be raised to participate in eternal judgment. How can those of us who believe in eternal torment not see the consistency with the psalmist saying, God, in your time, according to your righteous judgment, bring the curse that you have determined upon the wicked, upon the evil, as you have said you would. This is no different than Isaiah speaking about the rebels in chapter 1 and the rebels in chapter 66 on what is going to be their state and their eternal lot because of their rebellion against Yahweh. Now, does that mean that when your next door neighbor, think about what my next door neighbors have done in the past. When they wake you up at 2 o'clock in the morning with with the revving of engines and the drunken revelry of a party going on next door, is your first response to say, Lord, send fire from heaven right now and consume my ungodly neighbors and their house? I don't want to live among the wicked anymore. But no, it is. I mean, if you're praying, Lord, do your will in their life, and if their will is not to bring them to salvation, what will be their end? And when you, like Paul, do reflect upon the fact that God is going to bring the same kind of action upon the ungodly enemies of believers during this age that they are now bringing against believers. And when you rejoice in that, how different are you from the psalmist with their imprecations? So in the end, it becomes a matter of God's righteousness and God's judgments. And by the way, I will tell you this, those who tend to be squeamish about the imprecations in the Psalms usually are the same individuals within your congregation who will ask you, how could a loving God send people to the lake of fire for eternal punishment? So we just have to say it's a righteous God. And God has said what will take place to those who reject him and are under his curse. Another issue that began within liberal circles has come into evangelical circles is, what do we do with what I refer to as the messianic nature of the Psalms? That is, the Psalms pointing forward to the coming Messiah. Because you can't read the New Testament without realizing the New Testament writers reflect back on the Psalms as speaking about Jesus. Well, the liberals say, because they have no problem saying the New Testament writers were wrong, is the New Testament writers were wrong. The Psalms aren't speaking about the Messiah. The anointed one in Psalm 2 is David. In fact, some liberals even say this is a reflection of the New Year ceremony of the ancient Near East, where the king was reaffirmed within his kingship. That's where you get the accession year, and then at the New Year's Day, the beginning of the first year of his reign, because he's officially recognized as king. And then every year after that, there is a reaffirmation of his kingship. And that's what you see in Psalm 2. It's the human king, the David, and within the David line, that the New Year's festival are reaffirmed within the kingship. And, somehow the New Testament writers thought that in some way was talking about Jesus. They were wrong, but understand that we know a little better than the New Testament writers about what is in the Psalms. So this messianic conviction is wrong. It's non-existent. Now, this kind of thinking has started to seep into evangelicalism, broadly speaking, not in position 1, non-existent, but position B, indirect. That is, the Old Testament is speaking about David and David's line. Exclusively, totally. You cannot read the Psalms and see within the Psalms an anticipation of Israel's coming Messiah, their coming king, the anointed one. That's past tense. What the New Testament did was take what historically in the Old Testament was about human kings and reinterpret and apply that to Jesus. That is the New Testament writers who do that. And so they would say the messianic nature of the Psalms is indirect. Hubbard, Lasore, Bush in their Old Testament survey by and large take this position that the Old Testament, God, because they're evangelicals, God sovereignly was at work within Israel's history and the establishment of the kingship and what David and the kings went through to lead them to reflect upon their experiences, what is in the Psalms, And the New Testament writers then were able to see how, providentially, what was historical in the past, can be a good avenue to speak about Messiah presence. And because they're evangelicals, all right, in some broad way, God was establishing this indirectly. But within their book, they make the statements, not only here within the Psalms of the Old Testament, they make this very strong statements that really it is impossible to find a direct messianic prediction in the Old Testament that would be unambiguously understood by the Old Testament reader as talking about Jesus, about the coming Messiah. How do we know that? Because the New Testament writers have gone back and shown, all right, you can see Jesus within the experience of the Old Testament saints. Now, neither A or B has been the traditional position of the Orthodox Church. And I don't think it should be our position today. We might have some discussion on exactly how extensive was the messianic implications of what is in the Psalms. But I would say, based upon the New Testament, that the New Testament writers are seeing direct messianic prediction within the Old Testament. Psalm 16, Peter makes it very, very clear, David was not speaking of himself when he talked about the fact his flesh would not see corruption. And Peter knows he wasn't talking about himself because we can go to his grave today and guess what? His corruption is a present reality. He was not speaking about himself. He was speaking about whom? The Messiah. And the question comes, well, did David know that? And my answer to that is, yes, he did. And particularly because Acts 4 says the second psalm is a Davidic psalm. And as David is speaking about the rulers taking the counsel against the Lord, his anointed one, the one that he will establish in the future upon his throne in Jerusalem, who will reign over the nations of the earth. Who else could David have in mind there but whom? The Messiah. David had received the word from Nathan in 2 Samuel chapter 7. We, even as we are reading it, have read it after reading the prophets. We have no problem understanding, going all the way back to Torah, that this is speaking about the king who's going to come through the line of Judah, who is going to establish God's rule over all of the nations of the earth in the future. This is anointed one that Hannah rejoiced as she reflected upon the Torah, that what God was going to do in the future. You see what the liberals and evangelicals impacted by them want to say is that in no way from Moses on until very, very late, until you get to the Daniel and the Maccabean time period, did this idea coalesce of a coming king. And so it basically seeped into Judea, to Second Temple culture, and that's what the apostles imbibe and interpret the Old Testament against. It wasn't seen by strict historical, grammatical exegesis of the Old Testament. My answer to that is bunk. You know, that as you go through, and it is true that, yes, it could be that God was using and starting off with the experience of David and then would lead David to reflect upon his experience and use language that David himself would recognize. Psalm 16, when I talk about my flesh not seeing corruption, when I talk about in chapter 22, my bones melting away like wax, etc., my heart becoming heavy within me. Yes, he realizes as he reflected upon what God had led him to write, that this wasn't just me. God has led me through my experience to write in such a way that I am speaking about someone greater than I. And David knew, as we see reflected in 2 Samuel 7, who that greater one was. God, you've spoken to me about things in the distant future. Father, you've spoken to me about what you're going to do for my house in the future. And the fact that only you're going to raise up my seed. You're going to raise up an heir within my family who is going to fulfill your plan and purpose for being that king that Moses spoke about in the Torah. Now, if David reflected within the Scripture, had that consciousness, why can't we say that he could reflect upon what he wrote with the same kind of consciousness that then is seen by the New Testament writers? And so too with the godly in Israel. How can you be a post-exilic worshiper singing these songs, knowing what Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel have written concerning the coming one and the scion from the house of David who will establish the Lord's rule, and be singing these songs and not realizing this is the ultimate hope that we are singing about within these songs? So that's my answer to the liberals and the broadly evangelical, that there is a messianic theme that is seen within the Psalms. And David and the righteous within the Old Testament, because they were men of Torah, knew that the ultimate answer was the king that God was going to send at the end of the days. And that's what their hope was. And that's what is reflected within the Psalms.
Just a question. Do you have any practical tips on when preaching through a messianic psalm, and it seems like in one portion it's referring to David, and then all
just what I said. The Lord has so worked in David's experience and words that David has spoken beyond himself. He has spoken things that did not take place in his life, but are anticipating what is going to come through the greater David. David, at that point, becomes representative of the greater David who is going to come. That's the way I would say it. Psalm 22, we've just gone through Easter, Good Friday. Psalm 22, I think, is, yes, it begins with the experience of David, but God leads David to express his physical sufferings in such a way that it becomes predictive of what the ultimate David went through on the cross, and the reward, the recompense that will come to him because of his suffering. And this is what I would say to the liberal and the broad evangelical, that having led by God to write in such a way, David would recognize that that experience of his suffering went far beyond what he physically himself suffered, and would realize, therefore, it is speaking about the greater David that is to come. Because David had that consciousness. He's the author of Psalm 2. He knew the one who was coming. Psalm 110, that some have said, well, there's a direct messianic psalm, that is it. And interestingly, again, Psalm 110, a psalm of David, Yahweh says to my master, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. And it even speaks about this one who is going to come. Verse 4 is a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. This is a Davidic psalm. Now, whether David was conscious of it when he was writing it, certainly once it's written, he can read that and say, Yahweh speaking about my master. Who's the greater master over the human king? Well, the greater king who's going to come, who has been led to be said, this one is going to rule over the nations, also going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And both of those are picked up within the New Testament. Jesus himself said, how could David say, the Lord said to my Lord? That can't be speaking about David. Who's it speaking about? Well, it has to be speaking about David's son. I'll take Jesus' exegesis over any liberal's exegesis any day. And then the writer of Hebrews picks up and says, look, it's within the Old Testament. Yes, the Messiah coming as a priest, but not in the order of Levi, but in the order of Melchizedek. And goes right back to Psalm 110 to show it. Now I'm saying that you don't have to wait for the New Testaments. David and the people of Torah would realize David is speaking about the coming king. David is speaking about the one who's going to rule over as God's enemies as a footstool. Going back to the second psalm. Oh, and interestingly, this king also is going to be a priest. You've already read Zechariah. King priest, Zechariah 6. Here's king priest, Psalm 110. And all I'm saying is, Matt, this isn't indirect or non-existent. This is there. That the man of Torah, beginning with David, who sings this in the Old Testament, would see it. Well, I have to leave it at that. Preaching the Psalms, get Dr. Lawson's notes. That Matt was so kind. And get his new work on it. But don't neglect preaching the Psalms. And just don't dip in them here and there. Somewhere down the line, take your people through an overview, and then as an overview, take particular psalms that reflect what is in that portion of the Psalter.